Please subscribe to our channel by pressing the subscribe button and the bell icon to receive updates on new videos.
To Thakur Ma and Swamiji. And before I begin, I know it is an incredibly tough and challenging talk to follow. People have definitely been woken up, but now they probably might not be in the mood to listen to anyone, especially somebody this young. But before I start, I think one of the most important things we can recognize, and I get to speak to young people and professionals and everyone across the country all the time, it is very rare that you have a chief guest who has a flight but who still hangs on to listen to other speakers. Please give a round of applause to Chairman Sir, who has been here throughout. Else people come, they light the lamp, they make a speech and they leave, but he's been with us throughout, and I think that is a true example of human excellence. I think Vivekananda sir has done most of the job that anybody would have expected from any speaker at a platform as such. He has truly echoed the values and the ideas and ideals that the Ramakrishna Vivekananda literature has inspired all across the world, and what human excellence in general just embodies. So I think I will much rather try and focus on teaching in general and how I got into the journey and the kind of leaders we can build for our country. It is true that at 9 p.m. when you watch your primetime television and you read everything about a bridge falling down, to a child not reaching a hospital in time, to a school not functioning well, or to anybody saying anything, a lot of times we sleep with pessimism. And in general, if you look at it, this country is greeted with two options. One is to watch your 9 p.m. primetime television and sleep with pessimism. The other one is to have the highest level, the fountainhead of inspiration as the first Prime Minister of this country called Swami Vivekananda, and wake up with optimism. And this is a choice we'll need to make as teachers, as students, as young, proud citizens, whether we will sleep with the pessimism of our media, social media, or we'll wake up with the optimism of nation building, staying committed to public service, using our education as an important tool. As I was introduced in the beginning that I grew up in small towns and villages of Bihar, most people often wonder that how a child who would grow up in small towns and villages of Bihar would go on to secure quality education at major institutions in India and across the world on full scholarships. But there's a difference in my education that I found only when I reached middle school. I first went to school at the age of 12 because my father was posted in these small villages of Bihar where there were no good schools or libraries around. But my parents devised a threefold way to educate us. The first one and the most wonderful way they devised was that in the small rented houses that we lived in small towns and villages of Bihar, on every single wall, they pasted the quotations of Shri Ramakrishna Paramhans, Ma Sarada Devi, and Swami Vivekananda in English and in Hindi. Besides that, they pasted quotations of great men and women of our times and those who came in before us. And every morning, they mandated it that me and my two siblings, we woke up reading these quotations aloud, and only then we got to work. The second part of our education came from newspapers. In these places, just to give you some context, newspapers would come in a day late. But my parents mandated it that every day we had to read newspapers, and growing up as a child, I would read stories of young children from all across the country winning full scholarships to study at prestigious institutions, representing India at international forums, and winning major competitions, and I used to wonder whether I can also do the same. But since I was not enrolled in any school, I could not even participate at these forums. So as a child, I picked up a very small habit, and that probably tells you the power of a good habit. And that is something that as teachers, as students, we can all inculcate within our educational institutions and in our homes. As a small child, whenever I would read that a child has won a competition, secured a scholarship, gone to represent India at a forum, I would write down the name of the competition, the month in which the competition takes place, who can participate, and when do the applications go live. Whatever I could extract from the newspaper article. But that was the second part of my education. The third part of my education was, of course, my parents would buy books and copies and they would bring it, and we had to study on our own, self-teach ourselves. It was only when I was around 12 years old, when my elder siblings had to write their board exams, that we moved with our mother to the capital city of Bihar, the city of Patna, and my father would commute 250 kilometers every Saturday evening to be with us. Then Sunday late night, he would again commute 250 kilometers back to be back at the bank where he worked. But these are three ways in which my education happened, and they led me to the founding of the organization that I was introduced with, Dexterity Global. There was a very simple thing that I saw. Since I came to school and I had this diary full of opportunities that was already with me, I started participating in all of these competitions. By the time I was graduating high school, I had represented India in over 6 different countries and won over 200 different competitions. The local media, my friends, teachers, parents of my friends would always try and applaud it and congratulate me for this. But there was one stark thing that I found in my education that was different from that of others. I would come back from Japan and South Korea as a standard 9, standard 10 student, and I would tell my friends everything from the flight that we took to the hotels that we stayed in, to the ideas that were discussed and the questions that were asked. And I would find that my young friends sitting in a classroom in Patna most number of times had answers to questions that everybody missed out at a global platform. Most number of times they had ideas that they would put forward that nobody at these national and international forums even put forward. And inspired by that, I realized that it is not the achievement gap that is coming from the effort that our young people put in or the interest that they take in different things. It comes from an information gap, that most young people do not know that these opportunities even exist. So as a young high school student, I founded the organization called Dexterity Global with a very simple idea: to connect young people with opportunities in real time. One of the biggest complaints that we have as parents and as teachers is that our children don't take interest. Another complaint that most people put forward is, oh, they have a lot of potential, but they are wasting it. One of the most important things that we miss out on is that when our children are young, not even when they are in engineering school, not even when they are in high school, but ever since they are in middle school, how many platforms have they received where they can at least unlock their interests? It can be a painting competition. It can be a debate competition. It can be a science project. So back in 2008, we founded Dexterity with a very simple idea, that if there is an opportunity that is designed for our young people, they should be the first ones to know about it. And a clear example for those of you who think that, oh, the internet is there and now everybody knows about everything. A very simple example is NASA organizes a competition called the NASA Space Settlement Contest. The children who win it are celebrated as the next Einsteins and Newtons and Teslas of the world. But can you guess the maximum number of entries that NASA has ever received for this competition is, and I'll give it to you instead of wasting your time in guessing, it is 952. From over 200 countries across the world, 952 children participate. The 2 or 3 children who win, we celebrate them as the next Newtons and Einsteins. That clearly shows a bigger problem that exists. We do not connect our young people with opportunities in real time while they still have the time to make use of these opportunities. So back in 2008, we started with this simple idea, and I think as teachers, this is one of those things that you can bring to your classrooms. Connecting your young engineering graduates, your young budding engineers with opportunities in real time. And I would not just leave you with an advice. If you would want, you can go to dexconnect.org, and that is something that I can share with you later as well. And every single opportunity that is there for children and youth every month, ranging from science to leadership to art to music, that is up there, dexconnect.org, and you can DexConnect either your institution or yourself, whatever you like. But that was the first part of why we got started. But the second part is equally important at an institution for human excellence. The second thing that I noticed at these major platforms across India and the world was very surprising. At these major UN platforms, at these major intergovernmental platforms, there would be young people who would be discussing issues of development. They would discuss things about clean drinking water, better environmental conservation, bringing electricity to every house. And these young people, teenagers, most children and youth, when they would come and put their ideas forward at these platforms, there was one similarity that I found in most of these young representatives of our country. They came mostly from international schools and world schools. Schools on the outskirts of our major cities, where the school fee sometimes is 3 times the salary of an average Indian middle-class earner, leave aside a low-income earner. And that clearly represented a bigger problem. That at a platform where you're talking about clean drinking water, at a platform where you're hoping to get the perspective of young people as to what happens when a power cut happens, as to how development is needed even in disconnected corners, you do not have a single representative who comes from those places where a child has seen that my mother used to go fetch water and it used to take her an hour's time or so. That there is not a single child whose homework has been affected by a power cut, who's putting his or her views at these platforms. But largely, this entire conversation about building a generation of leaders who can solve 21st century problems, the young people who we have ignored the most are people who face these problems. So back in 2008, 10 years, 11 years ago, we founded Dexterity with another very clear vision. And that vision was to power the next generation of leaders for this country. And for that reason, you'll see that Dexterity's mission statement is something very different from any other educational organizations. We say Dexterity Global is on a mission to power the next generation of leaders through educational opportunities. And a lot of parents and teachers who I get to speak with, they say, and they often ask, that this is very good that you connect young people with educational opportunities. You have programs that enable them to grow as entrepreneurs or problem solvers. You enable them to secure full scholarships. This is all good. But why do you talk about leadership? We don't want our children to become leaders. We want them to be engineers. We want them to be doctors. We don't want them to be involved in anything where they cannot have a career. And they are right in their own suspicions and assumptions. But there is a very important thing that we have clarity about at Dexterity, and this is something that can also be reflected in your classrooms. At Dexterity, we say, we are not an educational organization that also happens to focus on leadership. We say we are a leadership building organization that sees education playing the central role. And that is something that I hope as teachers in a young, proud democracy like ours, and in an ancient civilization so rich like the one we have inherited, you can take forward. The greatest disservice that we can do in a country is separate its young generation's education from leadership. And unfortunately, by now, we have been successful in doing it. 70 years into our journey, maturing as a democracy, transitioning from the ancient civilization to the modern state, one of the things that we have missed out on, the greatest disservice that we have successfully delivered, is education and leadership seem separate. Leadership has become synonymous to political leadership. And political leadership has become synonymous to bad leadership. Not surprisingly, majority middle-class people in the country, majority low-income people in the country want their children to be doctors, engineers, journalists, and separate themselves from leadership. The second thing that we have done wrong in our country is we have separated our kids from the life stories of great men and women who were that young in their journey as our kids are. Just like that, for an example, when we teach our children about Gandhi in this country, what our children know about Gandhi in general is that an old man with a walking stick who walked around the country and got us freedom. The only thing that adds to it is a word called satyagraha that they study in their social sciences. If you ask them any other story from Gandhi's life, they would know that Gandhi was thrown out of a train in Pietermaritzburg in South Africa, or in South Africa. But nobody tells you that even while Gandhi was thrown out of the train in Pietermaritzburg in South Africa, he was reading a book called War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. That a Gandhi, when he was the age of our young engineering graduates, our young college students, he was studying at a place called University College in London, which was one of the best universities in the world then and continues to be even today. But we have separated Gandhi's education from his leadership. When we talk about Nehru in this country, he's limited to a symbol that rose is. He's limited to a position that the first Prime Minister of India is. We separated him from his education that happened at places as Harrow and Cambridge. When we talk about Patel in this country, we have limited him to the symbol that iron is. And we have separated him from the education that he received at Middle Temple College, or the skills of oratory and negotiation that he had built growing up that would one day bring riyasats across this country together to build the country that we live in, including this part of the world that might well not have been India. When we talk about Ambedkar in this country, we talk about a poor guy who went on to give us the Constitution of India. We forget the journey of a young child who was sponsored by a gentleman named Maharaja Sayaji Rao Gaikwad in this country, who was actually inspired by Swami Vivekananda, whose education was sponsored at a place called Columbia University, whose education played an equally important role in the journey that he had as the man we remember. And in the journey of Gandhi or Patel or Nehru or Ambedkar, the other thing we have separated from their leadership, we have not just separated their education. We have not just separated what Gandhi was doing when he was 21, what Patel was doing when he was 21, what Ambedkar and Nehru were doing when they were 21. We have also separated the most important part of their education. And that is Gandhi's travels across the country, his seva and samvad across this place, and even in a place like Africa. We have separated Nehru from his journeys across the country. We have separated Patel from his communication and service across the country, and so have we separated the entire coming up of a young Ambedkar, despite hardships, staying focused. Swami Ranganathananji Maharaj, the president of the mission at one point, he notes that in his interaction with Ambedkar, he writes that he could not stop thinking of that point that this child came despite all these hardships and still continued to build his path forward. But in all of them, if there's something that we see, first thing we can do for our children is bridge the gap between their education and leadership. Second thing we can do for our children is that we give them examples of people, what they were doing when they were their age. The third thing we can do is we remind our young citizens and old citizens that the education of Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, Ambedkar, any of those for that matter, was integrated with their seva and samvad, two things that our young people have been separated from to a very large degree. But then when you look at all these things put together, I think we can start asking and answering the question that we ask and answer very rarely in our country. We send thousands and thousands of children through school in this country without ever asking them or without ever telling them, why do we send you to school? We spend years in college, engineering college, management college, without ever asking our children or telling our children, why does a country send a generation to college? And if we are able to remind our children of these two questions, these two fundamental questions, why do we send you to school? Why do we send you to college? Nation building, human excellence, these things will begin to flow on their own. But even that conversation does not start. That can build the premise for a larger journey in seva and samvad that our young people can take on. One of the most surprising things that I see, I get to travel across the country and speak with our countrymen. I meet with teachers who sometimes after the speech ask, I also want to do something like you. I also want to do seva. How can I do it? It is most surprising that in this country we had a president who retired happily saying, now I want to become a teacher. Now I want to stay a teacher. There cannot be a bigger service than teaching. And when teachers sometimes ask, how can I get involved in service? Somewhere our priorities have been misplaced. Job and service, again like education and leadership, have been bridged apart. So that is one thing. The second thing is, speaking to our young people at our major colleges, one of the other things that I see that our children rarely find is they fail to connect what they are learning in their classroom to the problem that is happening in the community or in the country or in the society. And through our classes, we need to bridge our classroom with real things that are happening outside. And one of the most important examples that I think we can give to our children is that of why in general, generation after generation, we educate or we send anyone to university that I was talking about a few seconds back. I work with middle school and high school children, so my examples are extremely simple. But one of the most simple example I hope you will take back from here to your classroom is that of those who we called the least advanced people in human civilization. The early men. The early men, when we teach about them to our children, we call them the least advanced people in human civilization. But if you look at a very simple example that your engineering graduates especially can take, when the early man first saw fire, the early man could have run away like many of our students will, or many of us will. When the early man first saw fire, the early man could have kept walking. But the first thing the early man did was, the early man paused. And that is the most important thing I think we can teach our young citizens today. Begin to pause. If there is a problem, pause. If someone is in pain, pause. If there is need for a conversation, pause. But the first example we can take from that early man is begin to pause. The second thing is, the early man did not just pause. The early man also felt that this fire was keeping him warm, and quickly realized that 6 months later, when winter strikes, this fire can keep us warm. So the early man is not just pausing, but also seeing the utility of something that is happening. The next thing, if you look at, is that the early man saw that these animals that were all running away from fire, that used to usually attack the early man and the community. And he was quick enough to realize that if these animals try to attack us, fire can protect us. And then, when the fire was over, the early man ate these vegetables and fruits and realized that food tastes better when it is cooked in fire. But one small fire, and the early man realizes 3 quick utilities. And then you look at it, the early man, like our proud citizens, or as our graduates, could have very well patented that technology, could have limited it to himself. They could have sold it. But they realized a larger responsibility. They transferred it across generation, across location. And for that simple reason, I don't know what your definition of education is. I don't know why you went to university to teach. I don't know how you have seen education so far. But that is a very simple example. The early man who had been to no school, no university, passed that knowledge forward to the next generation. And if you look at it, then a generation built upon it and found a way to control and create fire. Then a generation built upon it and found heat energy in general. Then a generation built upon it and you've got steam engine and electric heaters and coolers and air conditioners and everywhere where heat energy could be transferred. This is just one example of why we send a generation to school, why we send a generation to college. We do not come to the planet and then leave. We come so that we can build upon what we have received, so that we can further enhance and advance where we stand. And that example is clear. People in previous generations who went to school and colleges, someone fought for democracies as soldier or as statesman. Someone brought telephonic communication. Some brought internet. Some brought cure for those diseases that would claim life very simply, like common cold and others. And that is simply the reason why this generation is in school. And that largely the sum and substance of everything I've spoken about so far, that gets to what Swami Vivekananda continued to talk about in his entire travels, in his journey, and largely in his life as his message. Growing up as a small child, the quotations that I was talking about, there was an example that my father would often give me, that is a Swami Vivekananda example, where he would say that an oak lives for several hundred years, but leaves no impact. A lily lives for less than 24 hours, and even those who pluck it, it leaves the fragrance out there, it leaves the beauty out there. The question is about purpose. And one of the finest ways to integrate that purpose back into education is engaging with our children as leaders already. when we see them as leaders, and I don't know how many of you will find the time for this, but 2 years back, summing up the work that we have done at Dexterity or we continue to do, I was invited to deliver a TED talk. And for you, I think it makes it even simpler. That has been the driving force of what we do at Dexterity and how we do it. And the TED talk that I delivered, the title was, "The Next Prime Minister is in a Classroom." The very simple thing that we believe at Dexterity is that the next president, the next prime minister, the next Sridharan, the next Kalam, the next Kurian, they are all in a classroom today. If you were teaching in a class and all of a sudden someone walked in and told you that the next prime minister is sitting there, would you teach any differently? And that is an important question I think all of us need to ask. We've spent our times in our office rooms and drawing rooms and dining halls complaining about something in the economic policy, something in the domestic policy, something in core values, something in communication. Remember all the complaints you have had so far with the previous generation. You can shape that in your classroom right there and change that when you walk in as a teacher. Because the next generation leaders are in the classrooms already. And as you continue to bridge this gap between education and leadership, one of the demoralizing things that our children have learned so far is that those who are intelligent, those who are hardworking, they are often those 9-to-5 employees. They'll get job, not recognition. They don't become those towering giants. And that makes me, and the second thing that they know is, and of course our education has contributed largely to it, that is that you pick one thing and you do only that one thing. But I largely want to sum up with these quick examples about doing one thing and staying well-rounded. And the second part is our education actually building the pathway to our leadership. My parents named me Sharad Vivek Sagar. And that is largely because my father, reading at the Ramakrishna Mission Library in Patna in his childhood days, decided he would either become a sannyasi or if he was forced into worldly life, he would name his children after Swami Vivekananda and make sure they read Swamiji's teachings. As a result, if you get at all any punya for making those decisions, you could choose Swami Vivekananda. I could not even choose him because I was already named after him. But Sagar in my name comes from Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar, Vivek from Swami Vivekananda, and Sharad because I was born in Sharad Ritu. But growing up with these teachings, when I first started making sense of everything I had read, of the gentleman who I was named after, the Mahamanav I was named after, I began to see that the patriot monk, how I saw him, was also an intuitive scientist who could engage Jagdish Chandra Bose on one end and Nikola Tesla on the other. That this intuitive scientist, his views on education could influence the East and the West alike. And this educationist, when on one time, and we mentioned it this morning, when this one time he would be on a ship with Jamshedji Tata, Tata would see such an able advisor and manager in him that he would invite him to come and lead the Tatas. But the patriot monk in a letter would write back and inspire Tatas to the degree that India's fortresses in science and research, the IISc in Bangalore and TIFR, would come into being. But that is the global leader that I saw in Swami Vivekananda. That is a well-roundedness and that is a human excellence that I saw in somebody who we can limit just as a monk. But that is the reason why in 125 years, we live in a world where languages have been lost, cities have come to an end, civilizations have been forgotten, but a speech is being remembered 126 years later. And that is the greatness of Swamiji's message, that his life was his message. That his understanding of human life and purpose in general can not just lift India, it can lift the world. But then I looked at other people who inspired me growing up. And those are the examples I'll end with. On the other end, there was a scientist who greatly inspired me. And in that scientist, I saw a saint. In a child in Rameshwaram, we found the answer to the question that this country had, that in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, what would we do if America tries to bully us? What would we do if China tries to encroach upon, or if Pakistan tries to invade? We used to ask these fundamental questions, the answers to which came in the dreams of a child in the holy city of Rameshwaram. And that child went on from being Kalam to Dr. Kalam, Dr. Kalam to Missile Man Kalam, Missile Man Kalam to President Kalam, and yet remained the same man at ease while talking to a child 5 years old and a prime minister 5 years into office. And in Kalam, if you just look at it, after all that he and his team of scientists did, the same early man example of utility, replicability, purpose, transfer of knowledge, if you look at it, the same equipments, the same technology that made India a stronger power through DRDO also made artificial limbs for our children lighter so that they could walk and run. A story that he writes in his own biography. But in Kalam, you see that in a scientist we had a saint. And when we talk about Rameshwaram, I must tell the little told story of Rameshwaram. And the wonderful example is that Vijay Menon sir talked about it only a few minutes back. Rameshwaram is connected to mainland India by only one bridge called the Pamban Bridge. In 1964, when a cyclone struck, Pamban Bridge came falling down. And the holy city was disconnected from the rest of mainland India to the degree that the Parliament of India was debating and questioning how quickly can we connect Rameshwaram to the mainland again. And this country gave the responsibility to a 30-year-old civil engineer, who when he spoke to his seniors, he was told there is no way that in 180 days, the time allotted to him, this bridge could be fixed. But this young civil engineer, the first assignment of his life, of his career, would go on to fix the Pamban Bridge, while on the 45th day, the Parliament of India once again raised the question, and the person replying said that within 1 month the Pamban Bridge will be fixed. But that night, E. Sridharan was submitting a report that day 46, Pamban Bridge is completed and Rameshwaram is connected to mainland. That was the first assignment of a 30-year-old civil engineer, allotted 180 days to fix Pamban Bridge, finishes it in 46 days, a task he would go on to further replicate in India's most challenging rail line, the Konkan Railways, and India's pride and the world's envy, the Delhi Metro. But if you look at it, that character is built throughout the journey in school, in workplace. But then, when a book would be written on E. Sridharan's life, the Metro Man of India, the book was not called The Civil Engineer. The book was not called The Metro Man. The book was called The Karma Yogi. And that is an important lesson our young students can take. And when I talk about the Missile Man of India and the Metro Man of India, I think it would be doing injustice if I do not give that one final example. That in 1948, a year after our tricolor had been unfurled at the proud Red Fort, a young college graduate returns to India from the United States of America as a dairy technologist. Under the mentorship of a gentleman in Gujarat named Tribhuvan Das Patel, this young apprentice goes on to coin a billion-liter idea. And with a billion-liter idea, this person transforms India from a milk-deficient country, the country he had come back to. There, farmers were struggling. There was not enough milk for our children, and in 1998, Verghese Kurian transforms India from a milk-deficient country to the largest producer of milk in the world, overtaking the same United States of America he had left and come back 49 years ago. And in that journey of Verghese Kurian, the milkman of India, you'll find that he works with 9 Indian prime ministers, and at the end of the journey, the most expensive possession he had was a watch that his grandson had gifted him. In all of these stories put together, in the well-roundedness of Swami Vivekananda, in his message and in his teachings, in his ideas and in his ideals, in bridging the gap between education and leadership, in asking our young people why we send you to school and why we send you to college, and in establishing that it is only hard work, meticulous work, dedicated karma yoga, something that Swamiji wanted young people to practice more, where he said Hatha yoga you leave for later. Karma yoga is what young people should focus on. If you look at it, these are examples and case studies that should not only be brought to our classrooms, but also inbuilt in our classrooms through a larger focus on, and I would sum up with that, 10 things that we talk at Dexterity as a core ingredient of a young, proud citizen of our country. 4 key skills: independent thinking or critical thinking, research, communication, and leadership. 2 core values of empathy and fearlessness. 2 core commitments of public service and nation building. And finally, being driven by a scientific temperament and being grounded in spiritual values. And if we begin bringing these lessons to our classroom, if the shyest kid in our class, the child who's most shy, who believes that his education does not connect to a real life problem, who believes that a shy young child cannot go on to be the missile man or the president, those are the children who we need to encourage. Those are the young people who we need to infuse with the ideas and ideals of Swami Vivekananda. And for that reason, human excellence is this ongoing task. For that reason, this country endows upon you the responsibility to build that next generation of leaders. For that reason, 11 years ago, I chose to bridge the gap between education and leadership in middle schools and high schools as much as I could. Because this country, while we are talking about it, talks about a generation that is 65% young. The question as leaders of educational institutions we need to ask, the unpopular question, has to be what kind of young? The same population, if it is not the kind of young that we hope, it is if from these do not come out the workers that Swamiji said would come out of the next generation who will solve out these problems as lions, we would be doing disservice to India. So this is largely the message that I have for you. Let's go back to our classrooms. Let's go back to our office rooms, our houses, and in our homes, starting from there to our classrooms. Let's bridge that gap between education and leadership. Let's bring back the journey of Patel, Nehru, Gandhi, Ambedkar, whoever it is, in that phase where our children are, in those teens and 20s, what these people were doing. And let's build the next generation that can shape India for the better so that we can be Vishwaguru one more time. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.